Hey everybody, it is Evan again here. I am so excited for part 2 of Conversations with Dr. Chip Dodd. You are not going to want to miss today's conversation because we're going to be building off of answering the question, how are we made? Because his life mission is helping us discover how we're made so we can do what we were meant to do. I know that's something that I want in my life. I'm betting it's something that you want in your life as well. And so stick around today. It is going to be worth your time. Again, keep that pen handy because this is not going to be milk. And what I mean by that is I think about that scripture in the New Testament where it says some of you need to go back to milk. Some of you are ready for solid foods. What we're talking about in these sessions, it is not 101. We're in the 103. We're in the master's level courses. We're moving into not just a discussion of identity from an inspirational and sort of a retroactively, let's heal what was wounded, but now we're actually beginning to answer the question, how we're made. Because doing that releases us to be who we can be and do what we were meant to do. And that's my heart. That's Dr. Dodd's heart for you as well. Last week when we were together, we actually ended our conversation during the official filming or audio recording of it, where we were talking about this idea of finding, feeling,
facing, and feeling.
Facing, and feeling. That's what we were doing. We
the
were
three.
Yes, we were finding, facing, and feeling what we had been through. Mm-hmm. And in how doing that we were connecting that to this idea that we were made to crave, that from the very early on stages, we talked about the APGAR test that babies go through, and how we're made to crave connection, human connection, not just physical connection, but actually emotional connection as well. And that many of us, we go looking for this connection, but unfortunately the connections we find, we go seeking, as the verse in Matthew that we read said, we seek bread, but we end up getting stones. And this wounds us, it hurts us. And so sometimes we can create this false sense of self, and we can actually live with that false sense for so long that sometimes it can be hard to go back and find the person we really are. And that's really what we're talking about here, is getting back to that. And the way you do that is by finding, facing, and feeling, there it is, what it is that you've been through. Yeah. And so we ended with that. And then off camera, you shared something really interesting about the fruit that will come when you try to find, face, and feel. Tell us what you were saying. I want to just come back and wrap that up.
Connected all those dots in a lot of ways. And, we said in the very opening, you said that, referenced me as an expert. And I don't want to run from that. But what's even more, I'm experienced. I mean, it's like I'm a witness of what we're talking about, not just somebody who studied it, but somebody who's lived it. So, it's like I just want everyone to know that we're coming from a place of knowing it works, not a place of having made it up.
Right.
And with that said, what's astounding is that...
That's really good. I'm going to steal that from an expert and an experienced person. I'm gonna steal that.
It's like I'm a witness. Can't get away from it.
Can I get a witness?
Yeah. That's good. And so... When Jesus calls us to ask, seek, and knock, he also gives an example of, like, some have asked for bread and have gotten a stone, or asked for fish and gotten a scorpion. And he says, well, who would do that? Well, a lot of people in our audience go, I've had it happen. But he doesn't say that gives you permission to stop being how you were created.
Right.
But it does acknowledge that you've been harmed by people who pushed against how you were made.
Right.
But it still requires that to live fully, you've got to return to how you're made. You've got to find, face, and feel. Yep. And then that's going to lead you to tell the truth, which means you're going to be asking for help, seeking, and knocking. Wow. And what's amazing is taking the risk of that vulnerability elicits from others the possibility that they can do the same.
Wow.
So that person they know is taking a risk of being very courageous with people who are hungry to do the same. And what's amazing is that literally leads to what Jesus calls the fulfillment of all the law and all the prophets. He says it means to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. As you were born, so shall you remain. We need to be around people who will ask, seek, and knock. And those people are people who are finding, facing, and feeling what's happening inside of them, acknowledging what's going on, how they were created behind the walls. They're cutting doors and they're opening windows, and people are pushing into the cave-in, right? Yep. And so they're the people who start telling the truth. Yep. And they end up letting go, giving it to God, and seeing there's a process that actually works called healing. Wow. Hurt brings us to healing. Sadness brings us to acceptance. Loneliness brings us to relationship with others. Yep. Connected and fulfillment. And the feelings that were negative become indicators of telling us what to go do so we can live fully. So it's amazing. it's almost like the joke is like, Jesus is so smart.
Yeah.
Like God is so smart, when actually we've been taught so much about God is not as relational as he really is.
Right.
That he's more a rule giver than a relationship offerer.
Wow.
And there's our tragedy. And yet we've been taught so much that God isn't that.
Right.
That we end up thinking we have to prove ourselves rather than just be where we are.
And how often do we see that reflected in our own family relationships as well?
Absolutely.
Y'all, first off, I want to point out, it's amazing. I didn't know any of that stuff you just said.
Yeah, we found off camera.
We found it by accident at REBOOT. I'm going to say the truth is you talked about experience versus, I mean, how many of us in this conversation right now are saying, well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm experiencing at REBOOT, is a group of people who were finding, facing, and feeling. I didn't know that's what we were looking for, and that's what we found. And I think that's the beautiful thing about it. And I think sometimes, what's that, even a stop clock is right twice a day. So there we go, we had that right.
Yeah.
I think about one of the other things that we had right was we tend to go back to the very beginning to understand the present. That's my personal sort of view of, I believe that humans really haven't changed a whole lot. We're kind of who we are. We're wired how we were wired. And so we spend a lot of time in our REBOOT groups in Genesis chapter 3. And in Genesis 3, if you don't know that story, I'm going to summarize the first little bit, and I'm going to read a little section for us as we move into this idea of Adam and Eve are there in the garden, tempted by the serpent. Eve eats the apple. Adam stands there. He doesn't say anything. Then he eats the apple. Then all of a sudden they experience trauma for the first time. And that is where I'm going to pick up and read in chapter 3 of Genesis. It says, both of them, their eyes were opened. This is in verse 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made for themselves loin coverings. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees in the garden. And then verse 9, which is where we're going to camp out today for a little bit, says, Then the Lord God called to the man and said to him, Where are you? Where are you? And then we see in verse 10, he said, I heard you in the sound of the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And so you shared with me some things about this scripture that I've read this verse literally 1,000 times. I teach on this verse. I preach on these verses. This is a section of the Bible that I almost know from heart until I have to read the NASB version, in which case I only know my NIV version. My question to you is, what's this verse have to do with identity? What's this verse have to do with connection?
Yeah.
Because we talk about it through security, belonging, and purpose, but you shared something with me I'd never thought of before. So share that with us.
It continues. You said that we have to, very often we have to go back to the beginning to find our healing. You went all the way back, right? To the beginning story.
Literally.
But isn't it there again? I mean, that trauma recovery is about going back to the beginning. We talked in the first session, it said, as you were born, so shall you remain.
Right.
And once we get wounded without relational connection, we wind up going away from how we're made. We've got to return.
Yep.
You have to be born again.
Yep.
Return. Now we're going back to the very beginning of where we lost it.
Yep.
And what's amazing is that verse,
that's good.
Genesis 3:9,
that's so good.
We're actually introduced to something that seminaries rarely address, that we talk about, and many of us have learned that there's an omniscient God, there's an omnipotent God, and there's an omnipresent God.
Right.
But we don't ever hear about the omni-relational God. And in Genesis 3:9, we get introduced to the omni-relational God. Because that English verse that says, where are you? It sounds like a throw-off line, like you can't find them, it's hide and go seek or something. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, and especially considering, God built it. He kind of knows it.
I can't find you. And it was a question. The Hebrew word is rich and deep there. The word is ayika. Well, that's a southern sound. I don't know how you actually say it in Hebrew, but ayika. But A-Y-E-K-A.
Sounds like my car when it's turned about.
It sounds like an animal.
Yeah.
But God came into the garden, and ayika is a word that means lament. It is the heartache of a parent wondering and wandering in searching for their child's heart, the emotional connection. So God came in search of us after we had left behind how we were created. Because had we responded with, I'm afraid, come help me, instead of going from feeling to figuring, had we listened to how we were made and used our mouths to speak our hearts, things would be different today.
Yeah.
But instead, we didn't. So God comes into the garden and offers us opportunity to connect. He's making himself completely vulnerable to us with a heartache, and he's asking us for our hearts to ache back.
Wow.
It's amazing. And the man said, I was afraid. He responded with the language he was created to speak.
Wow.
He acknowledged fear. And when he acknowledged fear and told the truth, I was afraid, so I hid. And that's our tragedy. Instead of crying out, we've been hiding out ever since. But in that admission, God and the humanity connected again. Now, I know it initiated theologically the long road to redemption.
Right.
And we have lived east of Eden and west of glory ever since.
Wow.
We're not at the home we're made to go to, and we had to leave behind what we were made to live like.
Wow.
But that didn't stop us from God being God and us being how we were made.
Yeah.
And our response to get connected is to tell the truth about how we feel.
Yeah.
And God never, ever stops asking the first question that he asked as the first question he ever spoke. And it's the question of every parent, every marriage. I remember sitting on a sofa one night, and I was just sitting. Sonia and I were watching television, and she looked over and she said, "Where are you?" I said, "We're sitting right here." She said, "No, where are you? You seem gone. You seem gone."
Right.
And I'm like, "Well, actually, I'm sad, Sonia. That my father just passed away not too long ago, and I guess I was just sitting there." And she was, "Thank you, Chip." I mean, she just reached out and touched my hand for a second, but she was hungering to connect to me, and she couldn't connect to me if she didn't know where I was. And that's an emotional response to an internal question asking about my internal. And through that connection, we end up gaining strength, we end up gaining courage, we end up gaining trust, confidence, and on and on. So, yeah.
So, okay, so the word Aika was an emotional question. It wasn't a physical location. It wasn't a GPS question. And it was, say it one more time. Aika, what was the statement? It was a question
Aika is, where are you?
Right.
But it's a question, it's a lament.
Yeah.
Like, I've lost you. I don't want to lose you.
Yeah.
I'm in pursuit of you. I'll do what it takes to get you.
Yeah.
But I need you to let me know, speak back to my speaking to you.
And that's
that's omni-relational.
Right. And that's right. And I want to pause. I want to just ask this question, because I think this is a good question for all of us to consider, which is, if we say that God is still asking that question today, right? The question is, where are we hearing that? Where are we hearing God asking us that Aika question of where are you? Right? Because I wonder how many times, one, he asks us because we are far away from him spiritually and emotionally, but also how many times maybe he's asking it to say, where's the true you? Where's the you before the trauma stripped you away and took parts of you and flipped them off like breakers on a box? He's saying, I want the whole house lit up. Let's flip those breakers back on. Where are you? As we've been talking through this subject of this emotional connection to God, one of the things that I sort of wonder about is, so often the presence of God I measure through how I feel about God, right? So I'll say like, well, I don't really feel God today. I don't really, but that doesn't necessarily change. In the Garden of Eden, we don't, when he says, where are you? You brought up that it's not a physical distance,
right?
Because God is still walking through the garden, right? He's still
there. He
there.
owns the whole thing.
He owns the whole thing. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about this subject of our identity, connection, understanding who we are, do emotions mislead us sometimes, or are they good indicators? How do we kind of harness the power of this emotional
That's a great
connection
question.
to be able to answer the question, where am I? And help us find ourselves.
Yeah, we talked earlier about, we have a response ability, okay? It's where we get the word responsibility, but often mislabeled, undefined, or defined poorly.
Right.
Responsibility comes from our ability to respond to how we were created and do so with integrity. It's a long way to say we're able to tell the truth if we have the truth to tell.
Yeah.
But a lot of times we get in our woundedness, it goes away. We have to put it somewhere else because nobody cares, or we get harmed if we do. But the thing is, responsibility is like, I am a feeling creature. It's my ability to respond to those things in a good way. Feelings are never wrong if it's the really core feelings. Those 8 feelings, they're never ever wrong. What I do with them could be way off course. And most of the harm that we do to each other and others is when we reject ownership of the feelings, and it's how we hide them that harms others. For example, like if you're around somebody who is hurt and they deny they're hurt, they're going to hurt you. Resentful people become harmful people.
Wow.
Right? But a person who will own their hurt and say, I'm hurting, I need help, I need healing, where do I go? They're not harmful.
Interesting.
So it's what you do with the feelings that matters.
It's a really good point.
Not having them or not. Having them is essential.
That's just really interesting what you just said, that an ideal person who's saying, hey, I'm hurting, I need help, they're not a threat to you.
No, they're asking, seeking, and knocking.
Yeah.
But the other person who acts out their hurt hurts others. Think about this too. A person who's lonely and won't admit it, they're isolating from relationship. And so they're communicating apathy to another person, leaves them lonely. A person who's sad and won't acknowledge that they're in grief, they end up leaving others sad because they won't connect. Isn't that amazing? Either we own our feelings, or others have to own them for us, or they have to go away from us.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is.
So feelings aren't weakness, feelings are strength.
Yeah.
For connection.
And I want to just sort of ask us all this question, this idea of that our feelings are a thing that can lead us back to asking, seeking, and knocking. I think that's something that's really fascinating. I wonder how often our fear, right? He said, I was afraid, so I hid. And I want to know how many times in your life, like it has in mine, has fear been the emotion that you felt that's actually kept you from answering the question, where are you? Earlier I asked you to consider when is God, or where is God still asking you, where are you? Where is he reaching out emotionally to connect with you today? And my question is maybe there's one of the main reasons I think that sometimes we don't connect with God actually is because we're afraid to be fully known. We're afraid that if he finds us, we won't be good enough for him. And so I want to just ask you, how many times has fear been something that was your initial response that's actually kept you from reconnecting or connecting with God in the first place? As we close out this, I want to end with this concept of fear and connection, and how fear maybe creates I don't want to put words in your mouth, how fear and connection relate.
Yeah.
Because I find it interesting that he says, I was afraid, so I hid. And then you see shame later on, I covered myself. So shame. So I want to just understand the connection between fear and connection, especially for those of us who have been handed a stone when we ask for bread. And how we may project that onto God the Father.
Absolutely.
So tell us about that.
Fear that's not addressed with respect, in other words, don't get help with what we're afraid of, we wind up becoming ashamed of having been afraid. And we tend to start hiding our fear, and we try to become fearless, which means invulnerable. I never want to fly with a fearless pilot.
Right.
Because a fearless pilot doesn't run down the checklist. I
never want to fly, period, because I do all the time.
I want to fly with a pilot who has proper fear.
Correct.
In other words, they recognize...
reasonable fear.
Absolutely.
Right.
They recognize
Respect.
the realities of what can happen, so they're doing the things to prevent those things from happening if possible. That's fear.
Yeah.
So fear is a feeling that we've been given that lets us ask for help.
Wow.
If you grow up not receiving help, then you'll hate the fear rather than realizing you're really actually created to know that you can't depend or have faith on the people who would not listen to you. Because fear, in spite of what we've been taught, many Christians have been taught that fear is sin.
Do you like how he just says that stuff and then just moves right on along?
Oh,
You make me so mad. Wait a minute. Pause for a minute.
Okay.
You said we'll end up hating the fear. What'd you just say? It was so good. I don't want to miss
I don't know.
You
Play it
said
back.
we'll end up. You said we'll end up hating the fear. Instead
of actually, honestly, facing that the people who wouldn't hear our fear are the ones that harmed us. In other words, the anger needs to be there, not against ourselves, really.
Yeah, and I
we'll hate ourselves for feeling.
I think about how many of our military groups and first responder groups that we work with a lot of people who really haven't practiced any form of vulnerability for quite a while because fear is not an emotion that's rewarded.
No, and even biblically it's taught that it's a sin.
Right. So I just think that's an interesting concept, that maybe as we get older, that sometimes then that fear, as we mature, we start to lose the ability to be vulnerable, right? Because you said at the beginning, you said fear is sort of the you connected it to vulnerability.
Yes, the asking for help feeling.
Yeah.
And how are we going to learn how? This is my first time through life, and yours too, I assume.
Yes.
But the thing is, how am I
I
going
do
to learn?
have a time travel
Yeah,
device,
yeah.
though, which has been very helpful.
Yeah, how am I going to learn how to live it unless I have somebody help me do it?
Yeah.
They help me learn how to get experience, help me practice for results, help me anticipate consequences. So what's amazing, Evan, this is rarely gets connected. I write about in The Voice of the Heart that fear is the birthplace or the ground out of which good faith grows. Fear is the birthplace of faith. And faith...
Because it creates the I need help question.
Absolutely, and you get it.
Yep.
So
Yeah, because he's faithful.
yes, fear moves me to take a risk,
Yeah.
hoping I'll get a result favorable to me. And then when I do, I'll go, oh, that works. I could trust that I can cry out and there's a show up, right?
Wow.
And then it becomes a remembering it. Oh, it happened last time. I might do it again. And then finally, when we really grow into faith, we are comfortable asking, seeking, and knocking because we're certain that something's going to come to help us.
Yeah, you're not just banging on the door.
Nope.
So I just want to, as we close here, I want to just leave you with this question, which is, I talked about how fear may be holding us back from that Aika, where are you question. But I also want to end with this idea of reaching out for help and saying, hey, that's the first step towards restoring connection, towards restoring vulnerability, and ultimately restoring faith. And so I just want to ask, where are you sort of still afraid? Where is fear still an emotion that you're maybe not trusting the person to your left or the person to your right, or maybe you're not trusting the person you're married to in a romantic relationship with, or maybe you're not trusting God really, as you're afraid of being vulnerable. You're afraid of having to actually know where they're at and then having to answer where you're at as well. So I want to just leave you with that question. The second thing I want to leave you with is this. If you're enjoying this conversation on emotions and connection and sort of how we're made, you can listen to these, but man, I'll tell you, there are some resources that Chip has, Dr. Dodd has, that are unbelievable. The first one is The Voice of the Heart. You can buy it on Amazon, but there's also a companion study that Jenny and I have been through. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. There's a podcast that you've just launched.
Yeah, there's the older podcast is called The Voice of the Heart podcast. And then also we've just released Living with Heart from Birth to Death.
There you go.
Which I'm really glad because we get to go wide and deeper than just the Voice of the Heart podcast. Yes. So please lean into my website and just pull out the resources. There's some free downloads about how the tools of expressing feelings, and we're always putting stuff out for free, including we did just recently, we did an Advent, which got me and you together. Yep. The Jesse Tree, which is a free download for families and couples and individuals to kind of like return to being certain in their faith.
That's it. So go check out those resources. We'll see you for part 3 of our conversations with Dr. Chip Dodd. Thanks so much for joining us.